If you're a major brand, one of your most important assets is your intellectual property, which encompasses your brand name and your trademarks and the like. So for example, say you're Apple. One of the most important assets you have is the name Apple. Being able to prevent a flimsy knockoff slapping Apple onto their computer and passing it off perhaps as being a rival to Apple. And this is where Rolex comes into play. Rolex has recently sent a cease and desist letter to a children's toy manufacturer named Oyster Pop. Rolex has asked Oyster Pop to rebrand. The ostensible catalyst for this is Oyster Pop has come out with a line of children's training clocks. These are bright, colorful clocks that are designed to help children learn how to tell the time. Now, for anyone who is following watches, you will immediately see the issue. Rolex has used the word oyster in the context of watches for an extremely long time, referring both to their movements and how those are put together, but also to the Oyster Perpetual line of watches. Rolex has been using it as long as I can remember, and they continue to use it. Nevertheless, this has triggered quite a bit of backlash from the general public, from the media who seem to have no idea how intellectual property works, and no genuine idea of how business works, and also from the manufacturer, who has asserted that no one is going to confuse their trading clocks for a Rolex watch, and therefore, why does Rolex have a problem? So it begs the question then, of does Rolex actually have a point, and is Rolex in the right? And the short answer is yes. Rolex has used the word oyster in the context of watches for an extremely long time. You've got the oyster movement, but also the Oyster Perpetual line of watches, where oyster has been on the face of those watches. This is analogous to Apple. Apple has a degree of protection over the word Apple in the context of technology. This enables Apple to prevent the word Apple being put onto flimsy knockoff computers that would just be there to perhaps take advantage of the Apple brand name. This is the case even if no one would reasonably confuse those knockoffs for a genuine Apple computer. In the context of Rolex, therefore, Rolex can assert protection over the word oyster in the context of chronology, even if that clock or that watch would not reasonably be confused with a genuine Rolex. They would still have protection over it. And in fact, the purpose of that protection is to prevent knockoffs using the word oyster or Rolex or these other trademarks on these knockoff products that would otherwise diminish the brand power of the word oyster in this context. Now, to be clear here, this is only limited protection. Rolex doesn't have protection over the word oyster in other contexts. They wouldn't have protection over the use of the word oyster in the context of oyster farming, or the context of furniture, or the context of bedding, or whatever the case might be. They would just have protection in the context of chronology. And therefore, Oyster Pop can't really use the word oyster on clocks, but they could use it in the context of other children's toys and the like. And as a result, Rolex is in fact in the right in this context. And if Rolex doesn't assert their protection right here, they risk losing it in the context of other things. After all, if they don't assert protection over oyster in relation to this manufacturer, then other manufacturers could come along and say the brand value had been so diminished by this other rival using the word oyster, the Rolex no longer had protection. It's kind of a use it or lose it type situation here. Rolex has to assert that protection right now, otherwise they risk losing it. And therefore Rolex really has no choice but to pursue Oyster Pop and to stop Oyster Pop using the word oyster on these clocks, and forcing them to rebrand, at least as far as it goes in relation to putting oyster onto their clocks and potentially their other watch-related items. Therefore, I genuinely agree with Rolex in this context. Nevertheless, if you've got any thoughts about what Rolex is doing, about whether Rolex is in the right or in the wrong, about whether Rolex should be pursuing this case, I'd be interested to hear that in the comments below. And otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in, and hopefully I see you next time as well.